War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to this week's episode, War Update. I'm going to focus mostly on the Iranian conflict. However, there has been some movement on the Russia-Ukraine front. There's a little bit going on in Nigeria and Africa, which I'm not going to talk about. So we'll start off with a Russian offensive, which is happening in the summer, which is traditional for that place. There's a reason why the Germans invaded. Everyone wants to do these maneuvers in the summer. The ground is dried out. It's not nearly as cold, which is easier on equipment. And things aren't melting and being rainy, which creates mud, which creates problems. But the gains have been extremely minimal. The Russian offensive has pushed a couple kilometers forward in a couple different sectors. So they've created salients into Ukrainian territory. The idea was to unite these two probes to surround the Ukrainian forces, but they never met. So they have two easily pinched off salients, which is simply a salient can be defined as a forward thrust through a narrow corridor. Salients are easily isolated and destroyed, so they're not a good thing. It's good for a temporary thing, but you want to exploit a salient. So a penetration that stalls, I guess, could be called a salient, whereas a penetration that succeeds would be a surrounding or an envelopment, things like this. So you don't want a salient. You want a penetration that ultimately gets into the logistics base of your enemy or allows you to surround the enemy entirely for destruction. So the Russians tried something. No surprise, it didn't work. At this point, it's just egos between Putin and Zelensky, both of whom are willing to let their countrymen die for almost indefinable goals at this point. The territory that Russia wants is filled with people, as far as I can tell, that want to be part of Russia. And, so if Putin really cares about these people, he's getting them killed. He's getting Russians killed. So it's an egotistical mess. And I wish there could be more analysis to this, but both sides have just enough to continue fighting. Neither side has enough to be decisive and end the conflict on terms that are acceptable to the others. And I think that's pretty much where we're at with Russia, Ukraine. Trump has given up, it appears, on trying to salvage something out of it. Neither Zelensky nor Putin want any semblance of peace unless it's entirely on their terms. If there's no compromise out there, then there's no peace available as long as each side has enough to fight. Russia is self-generating its combat power. Zelensky and Ukraine remain almost entirely dependent upon Western support, which Europe and the United States continue to give. As someone who sees war from a perspective of just the guy on the ground, the grunt infantryman, it's just a mindless tragedy. And I feel for the soldiers who are fighting on both sides. The dehumanization campaign seems to have gone away where, the Russians are orcs. They're not even human. I've heard this playbook before. No, they're just people, many of whom were drafted and are fighting against their will, being slaughtered for really no tangible gains, certainly not in the past few years. So let's move on to Iran. So not much has changed from the geopolitical sense. There's been a lot of incremental adjustments to the talking points, if nothing else. So the core of it remains Iran doesn't want peace and Trump desperately wants peace. So why does Trump want peace so badly? Well, one, oil prices, so he can get reelected. It's that simple. But you'll notice oil prices aren't ridiculously high. The market has adjusted and oil is flowing, albeit at a lowered rate, but not so low as it's causing huge pain. Gas prices remain lower now after years of inflation than during Biden when there was no such conflict. So it's not a huge deal, but they could be and would be much, much lower if this, if the Straits of Hormuz would be reopened. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard that the Straits of Hormuz are open. Well, kinda. So prior to this conflict kicking off and first Iran and then the United States shutting it down, there were approximately 150 30-ish ships that transited the Strait of Hormuz every day. Now, the ones that matter were the oil tankers, primarily, of which there are 35 to 40 oil tankers that would transit. Now, some of these are bigger than others. You have the VLCCs, the very large crude carriers. You have LCC, large crude carriers, so different levels. And I didn't bother to do the homework on what those levels are. But currently, there's about 10 ships transiting daily right now. And none of those are the VLCCs, the very large crude carriers, the ones that are going to adjust oil and gas prices in a significant manner. So for all intensive purposes, or if you prefer, all intents and purposes, for oil prices, the strait remains closed. And it's hurting Iran, but Iran is playing for bigger stakes. And I think that's the biggest thing. Trump wants to be the deal maker. Trump wants oil prices to go down. Trump has to deal with the recently reported missile stockpiles. Now, he kind of contradicted himself in stating, one, there is no shortage of critical munitions, and two, the people who leaked this critical data of munitions shortages are going to be prosecuted. I mean, it's intuitively obvious to the casual observer that when you fire a bunch of missiles that are expensive and don't have a high throughput, you're going to start running out. And between Ukraine and Iran, where ballistic missiles have become the, pardon the expression, air power of choice, our defensive capabilities are going to be outstripped by the offensive capabilities of the enemies who have focused on the proper means of air power, which are missiles, and always should have been missiles. And this is one of the problems I have with Space Command, with the Air Force, and the Army to a certain degree. So for those who aren't aware, missile defense falls on the Army and the Navy. The Air Force, despite their protestations that they are the guardians of air power, don't care about actual air defense against this air power. It's kind of boring. It dates back to World War II, where the air defense artillery was created from the coastal artillery. And when the Air Force was created, it was suggested that the coastal artillery and now air defense artillery fall under the Air Force. The problem with that was coastal artillery and air defense was a very slow route to promotion. So the majors had lots of time in service. The lieutenant colonels had lots of times in service, so on. Whereas the pilots were promoted very, very quickly. So had the coastal artillery been enveloped into the Air Force, all those non-pilots would have had seniority over the pilots, and that was simply unacceptable. So rather than unify the air power capabilities, the Air Force said, well, we'll let the Army do it. And this may come as a surprise, but the Army really doesn't care about air defense artillery for two reasons. One, it shouldn't be their problem. That's what the Air Force was created for. And two, we really haven't had to worry about it because we have spent so much money on this highly capable Air Force that we could neglect air defense artillery. We stopped deploying tactical air defense for many years. We stopped creating equipment to defend against air threats because we didn't think that any air threats would exist as long as we had the Air Force. Well, now drones have taken over. Naturally, because drones don't have pilots, no one cares, especially the small, quadcopter type drones, the really small ones. If they were really expensive and required, a certified pilot where he could wear a zipper suit and still wear cool sunglasses and a flight jacket, well, then those kind of drones are okay. But these small disposable drones have created an environment where the Army was not incentivized to create defenses against it. The Air Force could not care less about anything that doesn't involve an actual pilot, someone important, someone who matters. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And so we are way behind. And our throughput of both defensive capabilities as well as precision delivery munitions has fallen behind. We have more than enough manned aircraft. We have more manned aircraft than we know what to do with. What we don't have is anything to drop from them. And that's because the Air Force is, at the end of the day, a taxpayer-funded flying club, which is more interested in buying planes for pilots to fly than to actually have enough munitions to fight wars. And this is the same Air Force and Navy and Army, we're all guilty to this to a certain degree, that claims we're going to fight China, and we have reached what is known as Winchester in Air Force terms. Winchester is when you're out of ammunition on an aircraft. We use that term in missile defense as well. We've reached Winchester on a lot of our critical munitions, but we haven't run out of airplanes, nor could we ever run out of airplanes. We have thousands of them. Arguably, we had more aircraft than we do munitions to drop from them, despite the munitions being one-time use, and obviously aircraft being multi-use. So I'm bashing, and for good reason. We prioritize the wrong things. The Department of the Air Force prioritizes airplanes for their pilots to fly. I'm sure the actual geographic combatant commanders would prioritize munitions for these aircraft to drop, and probably munitions that could be delivered without using an aircraft over enemy terrain. Which brings us to the F-15 shoot-down that happened. Now, what's really, depressing, I guess, is that we have lost more fixed-wing aircraft to enemy fire and the results of enemy fire during this several-month campaign against Iran than we did in 20 years of GWOT. In 20 years of global war on terror, only one fixed-wing aircraft was ever shot down. It was, unsurprisingly, an A-10. And the A-10, I'm not sure if I've ranted on this previously. I'll do a quick rant on it. It's an archaic piece of garbage that should go away and exists only as a fig leaf for the Air Force to pretend it actually cares about supporting the Army. They don't, and the A-10 is proof of that. There's a lot more capable aircraft that they could be deploying to help us. The pilots are great. There's no dig on the A-10 pilots. They're great people who really care about the mission. It's just the organization that they fly for does not. So we have lost, and this is the best guess. We have lost about 30 MQ-9A Reaper drones. We lost an MQ-4C Triton, which crashed. It wasn't shot down. The Army has lost one MQ-1C Gray Eagle, which is basically the Army's equivalent of the Predator. It's much smaller and less capable than the MQ-9A, which is the Reaper. And we went over the MQ and our designations of what those letters mean in an episode past. Then we had the F-15E. Now, 3 of them were shot down by Kuwait. Thanks, boys. That was nice. And 1 was shot down by Iran. And it's the one that was shot down by Iran that I want to talk about for a little bit, because it was shot down by a short-range missile, apparently, a shoulder-fired missile. That we don't really know what is happening. Now, we lost an F-15E in Libya during those air operations, but if you read the published final report, they're just quick to say a lot of things went wrong, but it was absolutely positively never, ever, ever pilot error, whereas it was pilot error. If you read through the lines, they made mistakes, multiple mistakes that caused that aircraft to crash in Libya. We don't lose aircraft. So we have a couple of questions. Why was an F-15E flying low enough that a shoulder-fired or short-range air defense missile could shoot them down? And this kind of goes a little bit personal to me, because when I was in Afghanistan, I was in a fight, and we had an F-16 buzzing overhead who was providing nothing of value to my forces. And I asked them to come lower so they could do a recon and take a look and help us pinpoint the location of the enemy forces. We were taking some indirect fire from both machine guns, which you can do that, and plunging fire, and also some mortars. And the pilot came on and said, no, we are forbidden from flying below, I think it was 10,000 above ground level because of the risk of small arms. So they had a hard deck to protect that crew from being shot down, even though, again, this was 10 years into Afghanistan and no aircraft had been shot down in Afghanistan. No fixed wing Air Force aircraft had been shot down in 10 years, but it might be because of the rules. So why was an F-15E flying that low? I don't know. Then the next question becomes, why didn't the defense countermeasures of that F-15E work against defending it? Now, here's where I get a little bit overly critical of the Air Force, and I'll admit that. The backseater, the WISO, the weapons systems officer, the guy who's responsible for protecting that aircraft against various threats, was a full bird colonel, very dramatically rescued. And that full bird colonel, why do we have full bird colonels riding in the back seat of combat aircraft? Was that his normal assigned duties? Was he someone just, and here's the concern, was he someone who was not a full-time crew member, but was actually a high-level staff or commander who wanted to get in on the combat and failed in his duties to protect that aircraft while in combat? I don't know that that happened. It's merely a coincidence that the one F-15E that was shot down had a very high-ranking officer filling the seat that is supposed to protect that aircraft from being shot down. So I don't know. But it was shot down, very dramatic. They picked up the pilot quickly. The Wizzo, the amount of separation was crazy between the two. And then everything kind of fell apart. We lost 4 MH-6 Little Birds and 2 MC-130J Commandos. These are not cheap aircraft. And we had 2 more rescue aircraft that were the dedicated combat search and rescue aircraft of the Air Force that were damaged, the HH-60s. So we lost 7 fixed-wing aircraft destroyed, absolutely completely destroyed during this mission. 6 of them destroyed trying to get this 106 out of there. And they weren't destroyed by enemy fire. They were destroyed because whoever planned this combat search and rescue mission just screwed up on 100 different levels. They didn't think, they didn't do the proper reconnaissance. They rushed into something and made a bad situation far, far worse. Now, I got bones to pick with combat search and rescue because, one, there's a lot of assets dedicated to it. They have 100 helicopters dedicated to combat search and rescue with the parajumpers, the PJs, the medics, and then they have combat rescue officers. And every time they do one of these high-profile missions, it's never just the combat search and rescue community that's going in. If it's dangerous, well, then they need combat troops to support them. They'll bring in, Rangers, they'll bring in, infantry, Marines, whatever. Marines did the pickup on the F-15E that was shot down in Libya. And they have all these assets on standby, but they really don't like using those assets to do anything except rescue Air Force pilots. There were times in Iraq where Army pilots were isolated, a fallen angel, and CSAR refused to do the mission, combat search and rescue from the Air Force. And so 160th went in and had to make the pickup. So we lost 4 MH-6 Little Birds. Those are not combat search and rescue aircraft from the Air Force. Those are Army 160th assets. So again, the Air Force has a community that it spends a fortune on, dedicated, and yet they still have to rely on the other services to actually conduct the mission in difficult circumstances. Now, if it's not a difficult circumstance, well, then combat search and rescue flies in and does the mission, but then anyone could fly in and do the mission. So we lost 7 aircraft after losing 1, and we really don't know why. Now, in addition to that, we've lost 2 KC-135s that crashed into each other. We've had 7 damaged, both on the ground and then damaged with an air-to-air incident. We've had a F-35 Lightning, which was hit by enemy fire and had to make an emergency landing. We don't know what kind of shape that's in. And we had an A-10, which crashed. And I don't know exactly why. I think it was either directly from battle damage or while evading enemy fire. And that's one of the problems with the A-10 is its 30 millimeter gun that everyone loves requires it to fly a profile that puts it dangerously close to the ground. It also makes it very difficult for them to maintain the proper situational awareness to prevent fratricide. Despite the fact that the A-10 only did about 10% of the close air support missions in Iraq and Afghanistan during GWOT, they were almost 50% of the friendly fires. The A-10 is just not a very, very good aircraft in the modern era. And I'd argue even from the day it was created, it wasn't that good an aircraft. But whatever, like a lot of things, there's a lot of hype out there and a lot of people love it. And I do admit, they do sound awesome when they're shooting that gun. It's like a lion in the sky. It's an amazing thing. But if I was in combat and I needed close air support, I'd want rotary wing first and foremost. Then an AC-130, which of course the Army doesn't get. The Army will crash 2 130s to rescue a single pilot, but they won't dare risk a single AC-130 to support regular infantry in combat. It only goes to the cool guys. And then after the rotary wing and MC-130s, I would probably take a Marine Corps aircraft over an A-10. I would take an A-10 over any other fixed wing Air Force asset in support other than the AC-130, simply because the pilots are probably better at it. But, if you look at the numbers, you'd be smarter taking an F-16 or an F-15E that's less dangerous to the friendly forces, and they have a better loadout to support in the modern era with modern munitions. So there's me bagging on the Air Force for way too long. Sorry, guys. It just, when I know that I couldn't get any assets to literally save my life in Afghanistan, and to see how much was thrown away because of a shoot down, which I'm glad they got the guy back, don't get me wrong. But thousands of American soldiers died, and some of them died because of crappy air support. And I don't hold pilots' lives any more important than I do infantrymen's lives. But I would say that attitude is not reciprocated across the joint force, to put it mildly. So in this greater strategic sense, having lost all these aircraft, what are we getting out of this? Well, we are degrading Iran's military capability. We've held off on doing really crushing strikes against our civilian infrastructure. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think the Iranian government gives a crap if civilian infrastructure is crushed that makes the Iranian people suffer. There's no evidence that the Iranian government really gives a crap what happens to the majority of the Iranian people. They have bigger fish to fry, which is to destroy the West in the name of Allah. And so when one side really wants peace and one side really wants war, the one side that really wants war has far more leverage at the political and strategic level than the one that really wants peace. Because all the military capability in the world is worthless if all you want is to not use it. And I think Iran continues this at least until the midterms. And the interesting thing is there was time for Trump to bail out the Iranian quagmire before the elections. If he had gotten out 10 years ago, if he had gotten out, say, early October, he'd be fine. But now with early voting and mail-in and all this where we don't have an election day, we have election season, which lasts for 3 months, the window closes earlier. Because the people are voting 30 days, 60 days early because they got their ballots just delivered in the mail. They're going to look at the effect of when that ballot arrives and probably send it in. And if they're tweaked about gas prices or whatever reason, your window to operate even gets smaller. This goes back to Trump's biggest mistake was stopping Israel in June of last year in the search of a peace that was never going to come, and then starting over again. He either should have just either joined Israel or let Israel, in the phrases of today, let Israel cook last summer and stayed out of it, or joined them immediately to try to get these same effects, or just completely stayed out of it entirely until after the midterms. And you just can't ignore the reality of the midterms. His freedom of action as president, both domestically and internationally, if the Republicans lose the House and Senate, which they very well may, odds say they will, then this is all for nothing. And while we have degraded Iran's capability to make a bomb, as I've said from the very beginning before this all kicked off, as long as the Iranian government remains as it is, there will always be a nuclear program. We're only debating how far along it is. Oh, and the last thing, I've heard this before. People are like, well, I always heard, they're 2 months away, they're 2 years away, whatever it is. They said that for a decade. Well, it's like and we talk about cutting the grass. I can say my grass is 4 inches high. And then I cut it, it's 2 inches high. And then a couple weeks later, it is 4 inches high. So saying that my grass is 4 inches high after I've cut it, well, that doesn't mean anything because it regenerates. The level to which the Iranian nuclear weapons program regenerates is up to debate, no doubt. I don't want to say we should trust the Israelis because I don't. The Israelis unquestionably have better intelligence than the United States when it comes to Iran and certainly its nuclear program. Does Israel give us their full picture that they have? I doubt it. They give us the picture that is most beneficial to Israel, which is the continued degradation of Iran by every means
available. But even Israel has to acknowledge the realpolitik that the Democrats in Congress are more anti-Israel than the Republicans, far more, in fact, with the recent primary elections indicating that abject hatred of Israel is a driving component of at least a sizable minority, a very vocal minority of Democratic voters. So we will see what happens there, whether Israel tries to, Israel worries about Iran, worries about American elections. All these things play into it. This ties into Clausewitz. We'll get back into Clausewitz. I'll try to do book 2 next week. Try to get to that. No guarantees there. It's a little bit rambling. If I was to, the big takeaway here is Israel and the United States have two different targeting philosophies when it comes to strategic warfare. Israel targets leadership. The United States targets infrastructure, both military and civilian. Both have their place, but when dealing with organizations that are motivated by such ethereal concepts of paradise and martyrdom, targeting the leadership appears to be the more effective targeting scheme to establish meaningful change. I think the Israelis have it right in how they target their enemies over the United States cookie cutter. We're going to bomb the same things we always bomb. And I think we're seeing the results of this poor targeting doctrine that we are slave to. And I think it's time for a relook at how we do these things and not use the same targeting methodology in Serbia and Kosovo and Libya that we do in Syria or Iran. Just food for thought. I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.